Hey, Shango here. I want to give a little context real quick before we watch the video. This was recorded in a log cabin grange hall here on Vashon Island, and it does not make for very good video recording. The acoustics are bad, the heating is loud, and we have to turn off the lights so people can see the slides. Now, if you're there at the Vimeo meeting, it's awesome. It's very homey and intimate, but it doesn't really translate very well to video cameras. So I know this isn't as good of quality as some of the other stuff that I share with you, but this is a pretty rare talk for Ethan Russo to give nowadays. So I figured that getting what you can is better than not getting it at all. And it sounds good, but there's some high loud points and then it gets quiet. So you might have to adjust your volume a little bit. But all in all, it's a great piece, and it's serious analytical information for people who take their pain management serious. So here you go, enjoy. Please welcome Ethan Russo!
Welcome to the Funkadelic Grange. It's not everywhere that you can speak in a place that looks like Lincoln Logs. This is my email, and I do answer my email. It may take me some time, but you will get a response. So let's see if we can get the answer. I wanted to start out by showing you the names. Shango, maybe we could turn off the heat, both the noise and otherwise it's going to shimmer and people are going to think that they're getting off. But I wanted to start off with a rendition of Cannabis in various ancient languages. As you can see, starting from the top, I'll just point out a couple. The fourth one is Chinese, the kanji for ma, and that's actually a pictograph. It is showing stalks of hemp drying upside down in a shed. So anywhere in China, that'll be recognized as cannabis. Then, next to the last is cannabosum in Hebrew, which means aromatic cane, which was a component of the holy anointing oil. And then in the Greek, the more familiar cannabis with the accent on the first syllable. This talk is the same one that I give to physicians and scientists. There will be some technical stuff I will try to explain, but CB1 is the receptor in the brain where THC works. We have natural endogenous chemicals within that work on the same stuff. So this is a happy accident of nature. So the CB1 receptor is highly expressed in areas of the brain that relate to pain. That's nociception, and includes the cerebellum, the limbic system, which is involved with emotional type issues, basal ganglia with movement, also reward pathways that relate to whether a drug is addictive or not. Now, interestingly, there's some parallels between the way that cannabinoids work on pain and the way that opioids work on pain, although they're really distinct. And one of the main differences is this. The reason people die from heroin or other opioid overdoses is because too much of it will depress respiration. It depresses an area in the lower brainstem, the medulla, and people quit breathing. There is no amount of THC or a cannabinoid that can do this. So there's no fatal overdose that's possible with this kind of drug. But the endocannabinoid system, these natural chemicals within, is not just in the brain, it's throughout the body. In the gut, it regulates things like how fast things move and how much liquid there is. It's in the spinal cord and out the nerves in the body. The endocannabinoid system has about 30 different roles, but these were summarized in 1998 by Professor DiMarzo as relax, eat, sleep, forget, and protect. But it's involved in all these other things: pain, memory, whether you're going to vomit or not, whether you're going to have a seizure or not, on how fast the gut moves or how slowly it moves. There are lots of different ways that cannabis affects pain. Some of it is mediated by the CB1 receptor, but there are a lot of other ways in which this happens too. Some of it relates to neurotransmitters, those chemical messengers in the brain. There are interactions, as I mentioned, with the opioid system. We've got an endogenous system there. So we've got a parallel that morphine works in the same places that natural chemicals called enkephalins and endorphins work. And that's all I want to say there. So what are the mechanisms by which pain is produced? Analgesia is pain reduction. So this endocannabinoid system has a baseline level of activity that's there naturally. If it's too low, people are going to have excess pain. If the level of things are high, there's going to be less pain. Through complicated mechanisms, there's an area of the brain called the periaqueductal gray that's involved in the integration of pain signals, and it is especially active there. Also in an area of the thalamus, where cannabinoids like THC are 10 times more potent than opioids in the nerves that make these relationships. And then it's also involved in the spinal cord, and this is responsible for some associated phenomena of pain that are a little bit weird, like hyperalgesia. That means that touch is perceived as being really painful. Things like this. Wind up, where there's a buildup of these pain mechanisms. And these all relate to mechanisms of inflammation as well, and things as simple as itch. Itch is just a mild form of neuropathic or nerve-based pain. So what are the components of cannabis? We've mentioned THC, the main psychoactive component that works on CB1, but that certainly is not all. Additionally, cannabidiol, which is probably familiar to this crew. So this is the non-intoxicating anti-inflammatory component of cannabis. But the raw cannabinoids in the plant, tetrahydrocannabinolic acid, or THCA, also has an effect on pain, as does the raw form of cannabidiol, cannabidiolic acid. And then an especially important one is a terpenoid, one of the aromatic components of cannabis, called caryophyllene. Now this one's interesting because it's also working on another cannabinoid receptor called CB2 that's active out in the body in relation to inflammation and pain, but doesn't produce any psychoactive effects. So a chemical like caryophyllene that just works on CB2 doesn't produce a high, but does have benefits on pain. And then this is designed to show you how things used to be. So this is of a preparation that was made by Park Davis, a pharmaceutical company, about 100 years ago or more. And although it may be hard to read, the components are morphine, cannabis, and capsicum, or chili peppers.
Yeah.
So you've got 3 plant-based drugs that work on endogenous systems of pain. They didn't know all these chemical relationships, but this is an example of what we call empirical discovery, that people tried these things over time and noticed, hey, this is good for pain, and you didn't need to know the biochemistry in any great detail. What's interesting about this preparation is it's probably better than anything we've got through conventional means today. They probably gave this to people after surgery and let them go home. But as long ago as the 19th century, it was known that cannabinoids produced opiate sparing, meaning that when you gave cannabis, people required less morphine for pain control, and that it could be used to help get people off of those kinds of drugs because it treated the withdrawal symptoms too. So you may think this is a new finding, but we've known this for 150 years. It's just that a lot of people would like you to forget. As I mentioned, there are interactions between cannabinoids and opioids. THC actually stimulates the production of what's called beta endorphin. That's one of the natural chemicals within that has an effect like morphine. And it interacts in this periaqueductal gray area, the opiate sparing I mentioned. But animal studies that were done over a decade ago also showed that when THC was present, you could prevent the development of tolerance to the opioids. Tolerance means you have to eventually give a higher and higher dose to get the same level of pain relief that than was necessary previously. It also produces a rekindling. This means that if you give a dose of morphine and it wears off, it's no longer good at reducing pain, a little bit of THC will bring it back to where it's active again. And this is a phenomenon that patients observe too. The scientist, Diana Sikowitz, that did all these nice studies then, and I met her in 1999 and told her, gee, you know, this stuff you're reporting is fascinating, but did you know that they knew the same thing 150 years ago? Anyway, she was a little surprised at the time, but we became friends. A little bit more about CBD, some very interesting studies. These are, again, rat studies. They gave cannabidiol to rats that were trained to press a lever to get heroin. This is your tax dollars at work. But there were actual changes in expression of neurotransmitters in the brain in areas that relate to addiction that CBD produced and reduced the craving such that the authors of the study suggested that CBD should be used as a treatment in humans for heroin craving and to prevent relapse. So some wisdom there. Now this one's a little complicated. These were studies that were done in New York. They had a series of patients that sustained damage to an area of the brain called the insula. What happened, and it was a variety of different things. Some had damage due to car accidents, some from stroke, some from other diseases. But what happened was, some of these people were cigarette smokers. And when they had this injury to the insula, they quit smoking with no craving. Anybody who was addicted to tobacco knows this isn't normal. But they figured out that the insula was a very important area in relation to craving related to addiction. And it wasn't just the cigarettes. The same thing was shown for cocaine, alcohol, and opioids like heroin. How can you do this without producing damage in the insula? Well, as it turns out, as we see here in the scan, a very large dose of cannabidiol, 600 milligrams at a time, depresses the insula, and that's the blue thing you see here. That's the area of the brain. And what was interesting was this change was produced without any particular sedation or other major side effects. CBD alone is non-sedating. And then there are other mechanisms. I've mentioned previously CB2, the non-psychoactive receptor. There have been a lot of companies that have made drugs that are selective for that hopefully would treat pain without producing a high, because that's what the government likes. But none of these have been developed commercially because they all have ended up with various side effects. What was important about this was it reduced dopamine release, which is related to drugs that tend to be addictive, and rodents that were trained to be addicted to cocaine no longer would self-administer. In other words, it was a reduced addiction to cocaine. Again, caryophyllene, this natural component of cannabis, is a selective CB2 agonist, a drug that works there, and should do the same thing. And so this is an area that needs to be researched. Now, an old study from the 1970s, and basically what we see here is they're comparing the pain-relieving effects of codeine and THC. So this is plain THC, not cannabis. This would be like Marinol. And basically 20 milligrams of THC was the same as 120 milligrams of codeine. So take your choice, be very high or be very constipated. This was a study that was done in Sweden, and it was using dronabinol, synthetic THC, in patients who had pain related to multiple sclerosis. Basically, they showed improvement. These p-values are statistical indications of how significant something is. 0.02 means there would be a 2% chance that the result was spurious, was due to chance, and that's considered significant. However, the problem was, anybody who's taken plain THC knows it's not a very good drug, not very pleasant. And 2/3 of the patients knew what they'd gotten. So this is an indication the study was not blinded properly. If people can tell the difference between the drug and the placebo, it skews the results. But with a drug that's psychoactive, like plain THC clearly is, it's a very hard thing to avoid. This is a study that was done in San Francisco by our friend Donald Abrams. They were looking at neuropathy, nerve-based pain in patients with HIV/AIDS. Now, as a typical study that the government approves, we had to use NIDA cannabis. They required that it be a limited number of patients for a limited amount of time, and that they all had used cannabis before. So that's not all the population, and you can't generalize this to everyone. But I guess they were worried that someone would freak out and be a problem for them. It was effective. There was a reduction in pain, and about half of the patients had a 30% reduction in their nerve-based pain over the 5 days. 30% is considered highly significant to a patient. But there were a lot of side effects. As you can see in the table, anxiety in 25%, sedation over half, disorientation 16%, paranoia 13%, confusion 17%. This isn't the profile of a drug that the FDA is ever going to approve. This is a problem with all smoked and vaporized studies to date, with one exception. So you may be wondering at this point, how would it ever be that you could get a cannabis-based medicine FDA approved, or by that token, any botanical, a drug made from a plant? Well, there is this blueprint for this. It was formalized in 2015. Basically, you don't need to see the fine print. You need to show safety, efficacy, and consistency in phase 1 to 3 clinical trials. Phase 1 means you give it to normal people to see how long it lasts in the blood and what their reactions are. Phase 2 is you give it to a limited number of patients with the disease in question. Phase 3 is large numbers of patients. And again, with all this, the trick with the botanicals is eventually you've got to show everything that's in it, all the different components, and that they are within tight tolerances. There's not great variance over time. One drug that has done this is the drug that I worked on a development of with GW Pharmaceuticals called Sativex, or nabiximols. This was made from 2 different chemovars, chemical varieties. That's the proper term for strains. We have strains of bacteria and strains of viruses, but although everybody likes the name, there are no strains of cannabis. There are chemovars. In any event, it was from a high THC chemovar and a high CBD chemovar that were combined to make what is essentially a tincture in a spray in the mouth, what's called oral mucosal administration. And each spray has 2.7 of THC and 2.5 milligrams of CBD, along with terpenoid and other components. This, if you took enough to feel it, it would have onset in about 15 to 45 minutes. So a little slower, a lot slower than smoking, and a little bit faster than purely swallowing it. This is grown in what they call glass houses in England. We call it greenhouses. It's in organic media. They're all female clones from mother plants. No fertilization. It's all tightly controlled as to temperature, humidity. Good bugs eat the bad bugs in what's called integrated pest management. So no pesticides or anything else. In relation to pain, there are a bunch of studies that were done in neuropathic pain, pain associated with MS, etc. And we'll show some of the studies in more details. However, as I mentioned, the studies in the US have all been with NIDA cannabis of low potency, very limited duration. If we pool all those studies up until a few years ago with smoked or vaporized cannabis, it's a total of 3 patient years. So that would be 1 patient smoking every day for 3 years, or it could be 300 patients. Anyway, you can do the math. It's not a lot. In comparison, a few years back, there were 6,000 patient years with the Sativex, nabiximols, just in pain studies. So a tremendous gap in what the US has allowed with domestic supply versus what a British company did, including some studies in US patients. In other words, you can't really have a domestic source of cannabis and develop it as a medicine, but you can import it from a foreign country. So that's how much sense that makes. Basically, we've ceded this whole industry to foreign companies, and it explains why I've worked for foreign companies for most of the last 23 years. So let's go into some specific studies. These are with Sativex, the spray in the mouth. This was a study that was done for what's called peripheral neuropathic pain with allodynia. Allodynia means that a touch is perceived as a burning. It's a phenomenon associated with things like diabetic neuropathy. It could also happen as a toxic reaction to certain drugs like chemotherapy, etc. So 125 patients over 5 weeks. All the patients were on their regular medicines, a variety of other drugs. Could be opiates, could be anticonvulsants, could be antidepressants to try and treat nerve pain. But all the patients had failed. So you still needed something else, and this was just added on to see if you could get any improvement over the baseline. And this is what happened. So we're looking at 10-point pain scales. 0 is no pain, 10 is the worst pain you can imagine. And it may not look like much, but if you look at placebo, you've got a half of 1 box improvement. As compared to nabiximols in the blue is 1.5 points. Now again, doesn't seem really amazing, but for a pooled population, that's a significant difference. And you see the p-value is 0.004. That means there'd be only 4 chances in 1,000 that this is a mistake, according to the statistics. And in terms of how much people improved, again, let's look at the 30% improvement, highly significant to patients. Again, a big difference between placebo in the purple and the Sativex in the blue. In allodynia, this phenomenon of touch feeling like burning, it's not something that is treated effectively by conventional drugs. However, there was this statistically significant improvement with the nabiximols or Sativex. Patients' global impression of change is basically, are you better, are you worse, how much? And you see that this is skewed to the left, meaning that the blues are a lot higher than the purple. So the vast majority of people were somewhere between minimally and very much improved. Now, the same idea in multiple sclerosis. MS is not something that people who don't have it usually associate with pain. However, a lot of people with MS do have what's called central neuropathic pain. Central neuropathic pain, from whatever cause, is extremely difficult to treat and rarely benefits from any conventional medicine. But there were 66 patients in this study for 5 weeks. Again, unimproved on the best medicine conventionally applied and added on. So the same kind of thing. Once again, placebo, you've got about 1.25 improvement and about 2 3/4 on Sativex. 5 chances out of 1,000 that this was a spurious result. That's about as good as it get with this kind of study. And again, the patient's global impression of change is skewed towards improvement. It was about 4 times more likely that patients on nabiximols would report improvement as compared to patients with placebo. Another study in rheumatoid arthritis, and this is the only study, even though this is old now, it was done almost 15 years ago. It's the only study, formal study of a cannabis-based medicine in rheumatoid arthritis. There were 58 patients. The design was a little bit weird. The fellow that did it said, oh, my patients are not going to accept any side effects, so they decided they'd just give it at night. Well, this isn't a drug that lasts 24 hours, so whatever you see here could have been a lot better. So they just gave it at night, up to 6 sprays for 5 weeks. They looked at this 2 different ways. Again, by one measure, there was significant improvement, 1.5 boxes as compared to half a box with placebo. And this is a pain in the morning, pain on movement in the morning. Usually people that have this are at their worst in the morning. And then they looked at a thing called the DAS-28. It's 28 questions that you ask patients, disease activity score. Drugs that usually produce this kind of improvement are what are called disease modifying. You may see these advertised on TV. They're biologicals. They cost $30,000 to $50,000 a year, and they have a lot of potential nasty side effects, like creating tuberculosis when you didn't have it before, things like that. But there was this signal of benefit on this DAS-28 with nabiximols. Now, I'm sorry to say there's been no follow-up on this study, just because no one picked it up and funded it. How about cancer pain? There've been a variety of studies with the same preparation. The first 2 studies, phase 2 studies, were done in smaller groups of patients. The first study was done in hospice patients in England and I believe in Belgium. And then the second one was a larger number of patients, and we'll look at these. So the 2A study was in a hospice population, and so these are patients that are already on optimized opioids, the highest dose that they could use without terrible side effects, but with remaining pain that was still not at an acceptable level, plus a bunch of other drugs, typically these patients are on 5 drugs to try and treat the pain. And again, they're using a 0 to 10 numerical rating scale. Nabiximols, Sativex showed a significant improvement as compared to placebo, p-value of 0.14, 14 chances out of 1,000. And a thing called the continuous response also was improved over placebo. And the 30% response rate was seen in 43% of patients in nabiximols and only 21%, half as many, on placebo. Now I want to really key in on this one. In this study, they were not just using nabiximols. There was placebo, there was a high THC extract with no CBD, and there was nabiximols or Sativex. The difference between the high THC extract and Sativex is the presence of cannabidiol in Sativex. So if you look at the 30% level, the gray is the placebo response. And it's about the same as the response with the high THC extract. Now compare that to the orange, which is the Sativex, THC and CBD plus the other components. And it was statistically significantly better than the 2 other preparations. So this is the first demonstration of the synergy, the additive effect on pain of having multiple components, or a whole cannabis-based medicine as compared to what would have been primarily THC alone. So a second phase 2 study was done. This was what was called a dose ranging study. Patients were, instead of choosing their own dose based on their response, they were placed within narrow limits, a low, a medium, or a high dose. The low dose was 1 to 4 sprays a day, mid 6 to 10, and high range 11 to 16. Now, this did not go the way you might expect. Sometimes less is more. The high dose range turned out to be poorly tolerated because of the degree of side effects. Not a great surprise, but the efficacy was not there either. What was found was that group statistically didn't show any improvement in pain. So that was left out, and we'll look at the low and medium dose ranges. And what we see here is that at any level improvement, there was this clear difference between the placebo in the gray and the low and medium doses of sprays of Sativex in the green. And if we look at the 2 studies together, again, there was a difference, always a difference of benefit of the real drug over placebo. Again, with statistical significance, as you see here, the difference in the length of the bars. Then something interesting was happened, something that the FDA will totally ignore. From the first study in the hospice patients, some of the patients lived a lot longer than expected. So they had what's called an open label safety extension study. This means that everybody knew they were getting Sativex, and they continued on it and to see what happened. So 10% of patients took it for 6 months, and 5% for more than a year before succumbing to the disease or stopping it for whatever reason. 2 things happened. One wasn't a great surprise to me, and that was that they didn't have to escalate the doses of Sativex over time to get the same level of pain relief. Now bear in mind, these are people dying from cancer. That isn't what you'd expect. You'd expect to need more drug. But the real surprise was what you always see, an increase in opioid dose did not occur at all. We're talking again on average. So a really expected thing, graduated doses of opioids in patients dying of cancer, just didn't happen. But because this was an unblinded study, there was no placebo group, it isn't considered by the FDA at all, because that is the model, the only model that's accepted. A couple of examples. This is a patient with multiple sclerosis. She had disabling pain. On Sativex, she was able to lower, not only get improvement in pain, but reduced her dose of amitriptyline, an antidepressant used to treat pain, from a very high dose of 150 milligrams to 25 milligrams a day. And she was better enough that she returned to full-time work, counseling other patients. And these are patients I interviewed and had permission to share their stories and pictures. This is a Dutch lady with sciatica. Although she was Dutch, she had never used cannabis before. She was on long-acting morphine, MS-Contin, a high dose, 180 milligrams, reduced to 30 milligrams, and her pain diminished from a 9, excruciating, down to a 4, which is moderate pain, but tolerable. Now, we're going to go through some other studies. What I haven't shown you is the results of the phase 3 studies in cancer pain. Some of these were done in the States, but a bunch of other countries around the world. Now, these 3 studies did not read out. So unfortunately, the results that were seen in the phase 2 studies were not demonstrated in the phase 3 studies. Normally we would say, well, that shows it didn't work, it wasn't effective. But that really wasn't the case. We know this because it worked fine with statistical significance in the American patients. It did not work in the patients outside the US, but there was a clear difference in the patients. And I can tell you from having spent time going to clinics in Romania and Poland that those patients were sick as hell. In those countries, you've got to be near death to get opioid treatment to begin with. And if you fail that, you're in really bad shape. And it was demonstrable that these patients were a lot sicker, often near death, and they just didn't respond. So it was a problem with the mandated patient selection. Basically, the FDA was so worried that, well, maybe giving this cannabis-based medicine will give people cancer, that they would only give it to patients who already had cancer that was near death. And again, your text always at work. Okay, now, shifting gears. This is a really important study. It came out a few years ago. They looked at what happened to rates of opioid-associated mortality, people dying of overdoses. What happened as states legalized medical access to cannabis? What happened was, there, as you know, we have this opioid epidemic and there have been increasing rates of deaths over time. However, the rate of increase was much lower in the states where access became available. And the longer it was available, the slower the rise was. Really significant differences, such that it was estimated that 1,729 lives were saved in 2010. And they said, if the relationship between medical cannabis laws and opioid analgesic overdose mortality is substantiated in further work, enactment of laws to allow for the use of medical cannabis may be advocated as part of a comprehensive package of policies to reduce the population risk of opioid analgesics. Well, it's been another several years, and everything that's come out indicates the same thing. That when cannabis is available, you see fewer deaths due to opioid overdoses. Some other studies, very recent. They looked at various studies, animal and human, they did what's called a meta-analysis. This is where you combine studies and crunch the numbers to see what the stats show. And basically 90% of studies before giving to humans showed this synergy, boosting effect, combining cannabinoids and opioids. The effective dose 50, the dose at which 50% of people will find efficacy on pain of morphine with THC is much lower, highly statistically significant. And as they pointed out, the studies like the ones I showed you with nabiximols are not powered to show opioid sparing. In other words, we didn't want people could lower their dose if they had to, like they were super constipated. But it wasn't, the idea was to try and maintain what they'd taken previously and see if nabiximols made a difference. This is a study, 118 patients using cannabis, 64% reduction in opioids, while at the same time there was this big improvement, 45% in quality of life measures. Some of that could have been due to fewer opioid-related side effects. Stacy Gruber at Harvard did this study where patients were looked before they were on cannabis and 3 months after using cannabis medicinally. There was a marked improvement in depression called with a back depression inventory, better sleep, better quality of life. The people who had been on opioids cut them in half, reduction of about 48%. Also benzodiazepines, drugs for anxiety that are highly addictive, also about 50% down. Additionally, their cognitive ability, how they think, their memory was also significantly improved. Again, possibly due to having lower doses of opioids. So the idea that you're going to take cannabis and be a zombie is just not true. Then an experimental study on normal humans looking at pain, combining cannabis with oxycodone, a synthetic opioid, showed some of the same things that had been shown in the animal work, that when you had a dose of oxycodone that was too low to reduce experimental pain, it became effective with a very low dose of THC. So that's nice. A couple of well, some of these may be more meaningful to you. So studies, this is a study of fibromyalgia done in Israel, 26 patients using relatively low dose of cannabis, 26 grams a month. So that's like average 1 joint a day. 46% reported an increased ability to work or return to work. And there's a significant opioid sparing. 20 patients reduced to 5 that required opioids after treatment. And the p-value is 0.000. You never see that. It means that's real, folks. But because there was no placebo involved here, this study could have been done here and the FDA would not accept it at all. It would have no meaning at all. Another study done in Israel, reported this last year, medical cannabis in a large unselected population. Out of 344 patients, a third were on opioids. 36% of those could discontinue them. Almost 10% decreased their dose. Only 1% increased, and 51% were stable. So again, opioid sparing. Right. This is really unbelievable. For decades, high doses of opioids have been used for chronic non-cancer pain. In other words, low back pain, people with it could be on opioids for years. It was never studied this way. There was never a long-term study to see if it worked. Basically, to boil down a bunch of stuff, they had 240 patients. Half were put on an opioid regimen, half on a non-opioid regimen. After a year, there was no significant difference in the pain levels. The pain intensity was actually better in the people who were not on opioids. And as might not be a surprise, there were a lot more side effects in the opioid group, and that was statistically significant. And basically what they showed is that opioids don't work for chronic non-cancer pain. What opioids should be used for is acute pain. You just had surgery or you were in a car wreck, or if you have cancer. But if you have a broken ankle and the pain continues, you shouldn't be on opioids. So it's about time, 2018, that somebody demonstrated this. So what happens in a situation where someone is addicted, dependent on opioids, or they qualify as having cannabis use disorder, whatever that is? Cannabis can be used in conjunction with opioids, as you've seen, even in people who are dependent on opioids, but you need close follow-up. If they're better after a while, it is a reasonable thing to try and reduce the opioids, and often patients do this on their own without a lot of instruction from doctors. If someone has a high level of cannabis usage, let's just say 10 grams a day, it's been demonstrated by my colleague Dustin Sulak that they can be resensitized, as he calls it. What he has them do is quit for 48 hours and then resume at half the prior dose. And what he's found is the efficacy on pain is the same as it was at the higher dose. So much better to use less and get the same effect. So conclusions, the endocannabinoid system has a clinically important role in mediation of pain. Cannabis has a bunch of analgesic components, especially THC, CBD, and some of the terpenoids, especially caryophyllene. Clinical trial success or benefit of a drug is very dependent on the preparation. So just because something works, something different may or may not work. It has to be proven on its own. We've got one cannabis-based medicine that's been proven in a variety of clinical trials, nabiximols, approved in 30 countries, just not here. It is in Canada, but you can't bring it over the border. Something I didn't show a lot of, the side effect profile, adverse event profile of nabiximols is a lot less frequent than those reported with THC alone, or particularly conventional drugs. We know that there's a horrendous level of opioid addiction with mortality in this country. 72,000 Americans died in 2017. One, unfortunately, was my niece. But we need something, and one of the somethings is clearly cannabis. So with that, I'll be happy to take questions.
Dominic.
Ethan, what is the DSM-4 definition of cannabis use disorder? 5 or whatever we're at right now.
Yeah, you know, I can't quote you chapter and verse on that, but it's there are a set of criteria, and it'd be generally to be rated as addictive or having a use disorder would indicate that you have a preoccupation with the drug in question. Like, you think about cannabis all the time, or you spend a good part of your day trying to get it, or you commit crime to get it. I sense from the laughter that a lot of people relate to this. So there are a lot of flaws with this, and to be fair, there are a lot of psychiatrists that think that there really isn't any such animal. If you ask me, are there people that have a problem and use too much cannabis? Yeah. However, it ain't heroin. And yeah, it can be a problem. Can create family discord, people can spend too much money, any number of things. However, it's not going to kill someone. So we need to look at it a little bit differently and deal with it a little bit differently. I don't think there would be these kind of problems if we had more balanced preparations that had a significant amount of cannabidiol as well as THC, but that's not what people generally ask for. We had an important question down here about references for this material. Just go ahead and email me. Most of the material that I presented, aside from the most recent studies, was in a book chapter that came out a few years ago. I'd be happy to send to any of you in the back. Or like
Yeah, Jim.
Ethan, one of your examples showed a fall off in analgesic effect at higher doses. Do you think that that might be two competing systems, or a possibility of just a risk?
Yeah, I'm not sure which slide it was, but you bring up an important point. We know from animal studies, if we're looking at pure cannabidiol, that up to a point, a higher dose gives you better pain control, and then it falls off. It's called the biphasic effect. We see this with a lot of cannabinoids. It may surprise you to know that THC, we know that it reduces nausea. At too high a dose, it can produce nausea. But the trick with cannabidiol is, when it's a whole cannabis extract with the terpenoids present, you don't get this fall off in the response to pain. You get, no matter how high the dose is, you continue to get pain reduction. So this is really an important demonstration of why we shouldn't be worried about using isolates. Isolates are something that better fit the pharmaceutical industry model, which is, oh yeah, we know what the target is and we use one drug. Botanical medicine is exactly the opposite. It's the idea that, gee, we've got a bunch of components that act in concert and produce an entourage effect and a better benefit. And this experimental study done by Ruth Galili in Israel, showing this benefit of having a whole cannabis extract that's CBD predominant, preserves the pain reducing effect rather than having it fall off with CBD alone.
Yes.
Yes, can you talk a little bit about caryophyllene content in the roots and why it's important to use roots?
Well, the roots are important, but there isn't any caryophyllene in the roots.
Is there?
There are other components. I've written about this. The roots have been used traditionally as long as the tops have, and they do have analgesic and anti-inflammatory effects, but they seem to come from other components called triterpenoids, fridolin and epifridolinol, and there are a few alkaloids, not high concentration in the roots, whereas there are none in the tops. The roots haven't gotten the attention that they deserve in recent decades, but a lot of people are making artisanal preparations with the roots and reporting good results. So yeah, I wrote an article with Natasha Riz about this a couple of years ago, and again, I'd be happy to send that to anybody who would like it.
And if you want to learn more about the cannabis root ball, we actually interviewed Natasha Riz about cannabis root ball medicine on Shaping Fire podcast last year. Other question. Linda.
Uh, Using the product for inflammatory problems, how soon should you expect to see some results? Does it build up, or is it pretty immediate? And why do they pick the amount of time they use in a study?
Well, yeah, two different things. If we're talking about pain, depending on the method of administration, people may notice things pretty quickly. Treating inflammation is going to take longer. With a stable pain condition, we tend to see improvement over time for a prolonged interval. I didn't show all the safety extension studies with Sativex, but typically patients who are using it a long time actually decrease the number of sprays a day that they utilized. They needed less to treat their pain. So there is a cumulative effect. What they choose in the studies depends on what they think should happen and what the powers that be will let them do, okay? Now, part of the problem is a lot of the pain studies I reported were done in the prior decade, and 5 weeks was enough. That isn't true now. Most pain conditions, the FDA will say you have to treat for 12 weeks. Well, there's a problem there, and that is, we know from looking at a bunch of studies that the longer you treat, the harder it is to show a benefit over placebo. There's been a marked increase in placebo effect over the last 30 years. And it's worse for a drug for treating pain, any drug that's psychoactive, or in the case of cannabis, where the public thinks that this stuff is miraculous. I'm here to tell you it's not miraculous, it is damn good. But the way people think is that, geez, you know, this is my last shot. I really hope this is going to work, and of course, I must be on the drug. I'm not getting placebo, and you know, it's the way the brain works. It's a huge problem right now in medicine because many drugs that we know work don't work all that often. Something I said at dinner, Zoloft, sertraline, the antidepressant commonly used, they did 26 studies to show 3 where there was benefit.
All the way back.
I was wondering if you could share any thoughts or experiences with cannabinoid hyperemesis syndrome.
Oh, got a half an hour? So what he's asking about, cannabinoid hyperemesis. This is a relatively new phenomenon described. There's several hundred case studies reported, but it's more common than that. So this is a situation where it only occurs in the context of people who use very high amounts of cannabis on a chronic basis, only in that context. And I believe it's only in high THC preparations. What typically happens is patient will develop terrible abdominal pain and something that's and they get vomiting, intractable vomiting. The really characteristic thing is they will notice at some point that if they take a hot bath or spend 5 hours in the shower with hot water pouring over them, they'll get better. But they end up in the ER, they get expensive gastrointestinal workups, they don't see anything, and get, given opioids or other drugs that don't work. The solution to this is one of two things. The obvious one is to stop cannabis, and that takes care of it. What is going on with this? Well, nobody's sure, but it probably is this biphasic effect, that in certain areas of the brain, you're getting an opposite effect to what you expect from THC, that is producing nausea and vomiting and producing pain rather than stopping it. Or it could have to do with a down-regulation of the receptors. This is where they fold into the cell membrane instead of being out there and available. The other thing that works, and this is really weird, is capsaicin ointment. Capsaicin is the active ingredient in chili peppers, and if you rub that on the abdomen, it takes care of it. I will relate one story. Yep, yeah, it's really weird.
Does it burn the skin?
Yeah, it doesn't.
I think the solution to this, it feels like it does. It doesn't produce damage. Okay? My theory is that capsaicin works on a receptor called TRPV1. Cannabidiol works on the same receptor without being burning. So my theory was that you can prevent cannabinoid hyperemesis syndrome by having cannabidiol. A few months ago at a conference, I met a young lady who had this problem. We talked about it, and I said, well, first you've got to cut back or stop, and then if you want to resume, you need to be looking for type 2 or type 3 chemobars. So those where there are equal amounts of CBD and THC, or even CBD predominant. I'm happy to say that she was at the Emerald Cup in California a few weeks ago, and she is vastly better because she's using cannabidiol now. So I think that is part of the solution. So thanks for asking that simple question.
Can you discuss the difference in positive or negatives regarding hemp-derived CBD versus THC cannabis?
Sure.
CBD?
A lot of this is semantics. The original hemp CBD was made by abroad by using hemp refuse. In other words, they would use the seeds or fiber, and then the refuse that was left was chemically extracted. And they get a tiny amount of CBD out of it, along with a bunch of garbage. And that was hemp-based CBD. That's not the way you should make medicine. If you want cannabidiol, it should properly come from dedicated high cannabidiol plants and from the flowers. That's where the concentration is. So my best preference is to get it that way. And, again, selective breeding. There are now plants with whatever ratio you'd want of high CBD, usually low THC, plus a good terpenoid profile that is going to contribute to the therapeutic benefit of the preparation. So I will state clearly I'm biased, but that's the way I think it should be.
One more. Jay.
You went into a slide demonstrating 600 milligrams, I believe, of CBD functionally deactivated insula.
Right.
And what dose and how long did it functionally interrupt that addiction craving, if you will?
Can't tell you. They weren't looking at craving in the study. What I used this as an example of what could happen if you used high-dose CBD to treat addiction. Okay, so it's a good question, but that wasn't what they were looking at here. How long the effect was, I suspect it would relate to the half-life of CBD, so I'm going to say several hours. And and we could find out experimentally when we try this using high-dose CBD to treat people with addiction. We'll find out how long is it good for. My suspicion is you should treat people 3 times a day, maybe even a little more. That would depend on whether they take it orally or whether it's inhaled.
Cool. Let's hear it for Dr. Ethan Russo.